Now, to kick this off, I'm thrilled to introduce our opening conversation led by Fortune's executive editor for Asia and Brainstorm AI co-chair Clay Chandler in conversation with our first guest, Singapore's Minister for Digital Development and Information, Josephine Teo. When we talk about global leadership in AI, it's easy to focus on the big players, but Singapore continues to prove that small nations can lead in big ways. This isn't just a story about scale. It's about strategy, standards, and Singapore's bet that credibility can compete with compute. Please now join me in welcoming Clay Chandler and Minister Teo. Thank you.
Jeremy, and welcome everyone, and especially welcome Minister Teo. It is such a delight to have you back. You were our kickoff speaker last year when we first launched this franchise in Singapore. We had a great discussion that explored the ways in which Singapore was really pioneering how small and medium-sized economies could punch above their weight when it came to artificial intelligence. And I'm really quite eager to have a kind of catch-up conversation with you about that because so much has changed just in the last year since you were last here. I wonder if we could start maybe by just a reference to the AI Action Summit in Paris this year, which was a big event that got a lot of people's attention. Singapore there launched a global AI assurance pilot. And more recently, it's established a thing called the AI Verify Foundation. Can you tell us about these initiatives and what they are and how they evolved?
Well, Clay, it's great to be back, and I'm also very happy that you've returned to Singapore for this Brainstorm AI event. You referenced what we were doing at the AI Action Summit. Perhaps for context for the audience in the room today, the AI Action Summit that took place in Paris is a third edition of what started out in Bletchley as the AI Safety Summit.
Right.
And then in between, there was a summit that was held in Korea. And by the time it got to Paris, our French colleagues decided that they didn't want to focus so much on safety, they wanted to focus on action. But if we ask what we really want to see in AI development, the way Singapore thinks about it is that this being general purpose technologies, you do want it to be very widely adopted across many industry settings as well as across a whole range of organizations. So when we updated our national AI strategy, we thought that we needed to ensure that people understood what this was going to be for. So we said that the vision for Singapore was AI for the public good, for Singapore and the world. And why we decided to focus on public good was that the incentives would naturally create many commercial applications of AI. But for the whole of society to benefit, for people to appreciate its value, and this being general purpose technology, you also want AI to be applied towards public healthcare, public transportation, public safety in policing, for example. So that's one dimension of AI development that we wanted to see in Singapore. The other dimension is equally important. In many of these commercial settings, you would want AI to be implemented, deployed in a responsible way. So the question, however, is what does responsible AI look like? Well, it really depends on the application and at which layer of AI development you're talking about. Are you talking about the infrastructure, you're talking about the models, or you're talking about the applications? And apart from being able to articulate what responsible AI looks like, you also need to answer the question of, well, how do you get there? And if you say that you are implementing responsible AI, how do you test for it? How do you assure people that, in fact, this is happening? So As we were also promoting AI adoption, we decided at the same time that these questions deserved investigation. You need to put aside resources to research, but at the same time, it's useful for us to start developing practical tools to answer the question of what responsible AI looks like. That's how the Global AI Assurance pilot came about. It was to create a number of methods by which AI developers as well as deployers were able to assure their stakeholders that they were implementing in a responsible way. And the idea was also to learn from it, accepting the fact that at this early stage, there are no interoperable standards that apply across the globe. We don't know when we will get there. And so Singapore's modest hope is to contribute to this conversation and to bring about international collaboration so that we can all develop best practices in AI development.
Really interesting. There's a lot to think about there. I want to come back and maybe talk a little bit more about how assurance as a strategy aligns with the kind of commercial competitiveness objectives of Singapore. But I want to, before we get to that, ask you about one of the other big developments that's happened in the last year, which happened just about the time a lot of people were in Davos. I remember being in Davos and hearing people at the beginning of Davos sort of poo-pooing China's ability to catch up to the United States. Oh, Silicon Valley is so far out in front in these foundational AI models that China can't play the same game. And then right in the middle of Davos, there was this kind of announcement that emerged that there was this thing called DeepSeek. There was a Chinese hedge fund that had sort of issued this new platform in AI that was produced with a fraction of the resources of OpenAI or Gemini, but seemed to be pretty close on all the significant benchmarks of performance. Last year, we talked about the age of big data and AI superpowers, and whether that created daunting obstacles for smaller states like Singapore. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the implications for countries like Singapore for the DeepSeek breakthrough. We've had a couple of these other really kind of fast follower platforms come through in China recently. Is this something that even Singapore can now compete, by following those kind of examples? How does it open up and democratize the AI game for a country like Singapore?
Well, the thing that we ask ourselves is, what are the impediments of using any sort of technology for innovative purposes? And inevitably, cost becomes an issue. Because for a company that is deploying technology already in a certain way, to use AI as an alternative or as an addition, the question of cost must come up, and it has to be weighed against the benefits.
Right.
So when the cost comes down, then whatever benefits you were able to get from it may look more attractive. So from the perspective of bringing down costs, innovations such as DeepSeek are very much welcome. But I would also say that this whole dynamic is not necessarily only a competitive one. It is also mutually reinforcing. Let me give you an example. We don't use DeepSeek per se to develop our own large language model.
Right.
But within the context of Southeast Asia, we know that large language models that are trained primarily on a Western corpus, primarily on perhaps English as the language, they will have difficulties being applied in the Southeast Asian context.
Right.
In our case, there are already probably more than 1,000 local languages. And if you built AI tools on top of these large language models that didn't incorporate the kind of data that could be found in our part of the world, then naturally the quality, the way it performs, the way it responds to prompts will perhaps not meet the requirements of Singapore as well as our neighboring countries. What we did was to therefore develop our own large language model, not necessarily the biggest, but certainly trained on languages that we find commonly in our part of the world. Malay language, Tamil, Bahasa Indonesia.
This is Sea Lion.
This is Sea Lion.
Right.
You're very familiar with it. So I think there is room for both. And indeed, many companies, when they are thinking about how they can develop, for example, chat assistants that could be useful in our context, they would use a combination of both.
Yeah.
And so that's how I think about it. I think that in an innovation ecosystem, ways in which we can bring down the cost, ways in which we can complement one another in terms of the models that are available, I think they just open up the space for innovation to a larger extent. And in the Singapore context, when we think about AI governance and AI innovation, the two are not necessarily at odds with each other.
Yeah.
Being able to assure ourselves of the safety and proper governance actually, I think, can enable innovations to go further. Because then the developers and deployers know where are the markers that they should work within.
This is very interesting because it's a much more kind of neutral approach to evaluating technology and AI platforms. I mean, in the US right now, a lot of this stuff is very politicized. So we thought that TikTok was a terrible national security risk until we realized that it was so popular that we couldn't really stop it, and certain political leaders realized it was to their advantage to embrace it. But DeepSeek, there's still a lot of ambivalence about DeepSeek in the US. The US government is prohibiting government agencies from using it and trying to discourage companies from using it. Whereas I gather in Singapore, there's none of that. There's, well, let's look at it, and is it useful or not?
Or perhaps I would put it another way. I think when companies, developers, deployers, they think about what model they want to use, there is always an assessment of a couple of things. One of the things would be, of course, performance. The other thing that they would take into consideration is security and resilience. And it's up to every organization to evaluate all three and draw their own conclusions about what can be used and what cannot be used, or they do not wish to use.
Yeah, yeah.
And I would imagine that there would still be concerns about DeepSeek and other models that would cause companies to take a pause and say that maybe this is something that we are still not very comfortable with. I wouldn't be surprised at all. This is a very natural consequence of organizations having to weigh the cost and benefit, as well as the many dimensions of what makes an innovation worth the effort.
So the other thing that's related to this, and that's new over the past year, is that we in the U.S. we have a new president now, and relations between the U.S. and China have gotten, safe to say, much more tense, and in many ways
your words, not mine,
more acrimonious. President Trump is imposing very large tariffs on China. China's been retaliating in kind. The U.S. has tightened restrictions on selling chips and other technologies to China. I wonder whether, and we talked last year about Singapore's strategy of being sort of non-aligned, being a kind of a Switzerland of Asia, a space where both Chinese and U.S. Companies and tech players could operate together. And so my question is, can Singapore still do that? And this also sort of applies to the rest of ASEAN. Can it remain strategically unaligned, or are the two giants trying to force small and medium-sized economies like this one to pick a side?
I think Singapore's consistent approach is to act in a way that meets our own interests. And that is the starting point. That has to be our guiding principle. Now, we would certainly hope that relationships between the two giants can warm up to a much greater extent, but it's not something that we can wish to happen, and it will happen. I wish that was, something that we didn't have to deal with, but it's a reality. The way in which we go about it is to engage, all countries, not just China and US, and build upon our bilateral foundations, and to try and make headway in new technology areas too. So with the US, we have a dialogue on continuing and critical and emerging technologies. Similarly, with China, we have a digital policy dialogue. They cover different areas of interest that we mutually believe are important for our own countries. But it doesn't prevent us from seeking to understand each other's concerns better and then continuing to find ways to move forward. So in AI assurance, in AI governance, for example, with our US colleagues, we did a mapping of our own risk assessment model against theirs. And this serves as a basis for us to engage with colleagues elsewhere around the world, particularly those that are involved in the AI safety network. With our Chinese colleagues, we noticed that their industrial foundation is so broad and deep that the applications of AI would be very interesting to watch and learn from. So there are different ways in which we engage. With our ASEAN countries, we say, for example, that even if we are not ready to move into the era of standards in AI governance, there's nothing to prevent us from agreeing on what the ethical principles could look like first. And then with other countries that are like us, small, we created a digital pillar in the Forum of Small States, which Singapore is the convener of.
Right.
And with countries like Rwanda, for example, we created an AI playbook for small states. So these are the ways in which we are coming together for conversations around different aspects of AI, hoping to make progress.
Really interesting and thoughtful. I want to ask quickly, if I can, about scaling the digital workforce to kind of support a lot of these initiatives. The last time we spoke, you described for us the government's plan had a goal for training 5,000 AI practitioners in Singapore, and you have since tripled that, as I understand it, to 15,000. Why the increase, and how will you achieve it, and what will be the background of these practitioners?
Well, number one, I think there's a lot of interest. So many people in Singapore are aware of the potential benefits of AI, and they are themselves finding ways to acquire the skills. I would say that whether it is AI creators or AI practitioners, I'm overall optimistic about what can be achieved through our workforce if each and every one were enabled to acquire some AI-related skills. And you imagine that certain basic AI skills will become as ubiquitous as you and I being very familiar with using emails. And perhaps in the earlier stages, maybe it was not so common for people to be able to use digital tools, whether for word processing or making slides and so on. But over time, we all acquire a certain level of competence. But we think that it's not enough just to have basic level of competence. So what you described, the 5,000 and the 15,000, are what we call AI practitioners. We are hoping also to grow another pool to complement the data scientists and machine learning engineers. We're talking about people who are in the professions, lawyers, accountants, doctors, who will become the early adopters of AI, and then they show their peers how to make better use of it. We're also talking about people in different sectors, whether it's manufacturing, whether it is in healthcare or in financial services. They themselves also acquire this facility with using AI, and then they demonstrate how it can create more value for their organizations. This group of AI practitioners will have to exceed the 15,000 that I talked about to a much greater extent.
I see.
So in the Singapore context, our workforce is maybe 3.5 million.
Right.
I think at the level of AI users that are they are competent, you will need to get to a much larger number than we were talking about last year.
I see.
So you watch this space. We will have more to say about this.
We will watch it with great interest. We've got just a couple of minutes here. I wonder if we could come back to this initial point about assurance. It's very interesting to me because it seems that what Singapore is doing is it's trying to become a kind of a test bed for safety and responsible AI, and to create a kind of haven and build a brand around that in much the way that Singapore has done with fintech regulation and cybersecurity services. Is that the idea? And maybe you could say a little bit more about the philosophy behind the emphasis on insurance.
The broad idea is that this technology can have many applications, and you don't want to overly restrict its growth. and development. On the other hand, for a technology that can be used in so many different contexts, you've got to watch that it doesn't cause harm. Because the moment it does, and people become very wary of seeing it being used in even more ways, then it's much harder to recover from that sort of loss of momentum. So the way in which we'd like to go about it is to set out the broad directions and also to set out what are the principles that we should be working along, and then to say to industry as well as organizations that are using AI, let's try and find a way to define the risks and also then to find ways of mitigating those risks. That's generally the approach that we take. Small steps, not necessarily always big bang, but when we're ready to move, then move quickly.
It's always fascinating for us to kind of watch those small steps and to try to observe them and analyze them. I think that many of them are of great relevance and benefit to other kind of medium-sized states as to how they can navigate in this really rapidly changing technology environment. We look forward to tuning in again and coming back for the next installment of this conversation, we hope, in years to come. Thank you so much, Minister Teo, for
Thank you so much,
sparing some
Clay.
time for us.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.